Stories Untold is a science fiction psychological horror adventure game released in 2017 by the studio Nocode and published by devolverdigital. Adventure games are characterized by exploring, puzzle solving, and narrative interactions with game characters. The adventure label hails from the first known adventure game Colossal Cave Adventure developed during the 1970s. In Stories Untold, the player will do mostly three things: enter text into a writing prompt and hope what they entered progresses the game forward, text adventure, click around the environment to find interactive elements and utilize these elements in a specific order, point and click, and do some very light exploration. Stories Untold's origins lay in LihimSidhe, an event where game developers around the world challenge themselves to make a game from scratch in just a few days' time, aka Game Jam. House Abandoned was a product of such a game jam. House Abandoned also would prove to be so well received that it would be the very spark that would grow to become Stories Untold. House Abandoned became just one of the 4 stories featured in Stories Untold. Each story has the player assume the role of an unidentified person using various electronic equipment, ranging from locations that include an abandoned house, a laboratory, and a remote radio station in a blizzard. There is a 4th chapter, but to explain its location and task can easily wade deep into spoiler territory. It's very difficult to reveal if this game attempts to execute on a specific message or not without spoilers. So treading as carefully as I can, I will say that yes, there is a message to be found here. A tragic takeaway that can hit hard for some players who put in the work to leave no narrative stone unturned. Disclaimer: I'm not a fan of puzzle games or puzzles in games. They too often devolve into guess what the developer was thinking. More on this in a bit. Back to the regularly scheduled program. The development studio behind Stories Untold, Nocode, describes the game as the following: 4 stories, 1 nightmare. From the prototype, The House Abandoned comes a critically acclaimed, BAFTA-winning Stories Untold, the latest madness from Nocode. 4 short stories tied together in a complex web of psychological horror, intense visuals, and genre-bending adventures. How does this game execute on these selling points? Let's address the last line first: genre-bending adventures. In my playthrough, I walked in expecting a fairly basic adventure game with excellent presentation and left having experienced that same notion. This is all to say that Stories Untold, as far as I can tell, is not bending any genres. The text adventure portion of Stories Untold doesn't make a noticeable departure from one of the earliest text entry experiences, ELIZA, a program created in the 1970s that simulates a psychologist by responding to a user's text entries. In fact, after having played around with some of the ELIZA clones online, I'd say that Stories Untold actually underdelivers in the genre compared to ELIZA that was developed nearly 50 years ago. Point and click began with the game Enchanted Scepters in 1984, released on the Mac. In that game, you do much the same as you do in Stories Untold, moving your cursor to find an interactive point that hopefully drives the game forward, an activity unfavorably described as pixel hunting. While I do concede that Stories Untold executes well enough on its mechanics, would I also concede it is genre bending? Absolutely not. Mechanically speaking, it falls very strictly within its genre. As for the intense visuals the game advertises it has, I'm strongly inclined to agree. This game's visuals are a love letter to the 80s. It's as if the game reached into the past and brought a portion of that era forward in time, both temporally and visually. Stories Untold also executes on the psychological horror aspects as well. There were times I was genuinely frightened both via jump scares and or the dense atmosphere the game draws the player into. This game evoked feelings of fear, mystery, and foreboding of what was behind the next event. The promise of a text adventure sounds great on paper. Enter some text and the game reacts to what one entered, driving the player's progress forward. Just the thought of that fills my mind with excitement at being able to utilize my conversational skills I've learned in life to interact with a game sounds incredible. The thing is, and the reason I'm personally not a fan of puzzle games or puzzles in games, is that they almost always seem like playing a game of guess what the developer was thinking instead of the player applying their common sense to solve a puzzle. If, for example, in a text adventure game you are trying to walk around the house, you simply typing walk around the house may or may not work. Perhaps the developer perceived walk into the yard as walking around the house. For me, this creates a schism where it stops being about me versus the game and instead becomes a battle of how my exact wording for doing something very simple differs in verbiage and how the developer would write it. So instead of walking around the house and losing myself in a story, now I'm trying to guess what the developer thinks are the right things to say. What compounds this here is that the feedback is binary in Stories Untold. Either what I typed works or it doesn't, and I get the equivalent of an error message that doesn't offer any guidance on exactly what the developer was thinking or how to correct my mistakes. This guess what the developer was thinking issue wasn't as pronounced in the point and click sections of this game. These were almost always tests on one's observational skills and parsing over every little detail until the path forward reveals itself. Some of the puzzles I was willing to endure, and some, I just looked up a walkthrough to solve them so I could get back to enjoying the game's incredible atmosphere. The crazy thing about Stories Untold is me as a player desperately trying to scrutinize every little detail to move forward shares a strong connection to the game's narrative. I really appreciate despite my misgivings with the game's puzzles. As for the game's narrative itself, I say I left the game mostly satisfied. Throughout the game, the music, the visuals, the gameplay really got my mind racing with the possibilities of a world that was spilling out before me. Where could this story be leading? I excitedly pondered. And sometimes I was even afraid the game would provide an answer. Seeing how it was resolved was a bit underwhelming, I won't lie. I went from a mind racing with possibilities to a flat, oh it's that? Well that's something I guess. If there was one thing I wish this game did differently, it would have been to focus entirely on the text entry mechanic presented in House Abandoned. I said before I went and played some of Eliza programs online, and I love that there was no failure state. The conversation just continued, even if the code emulating a human would sometimes spout nonsense. I don't expect anyone, let alone Stories Untold or nocode, to conjure up a fully realized artificial intelligence to amuse me for my 3-hour adventure game, but I can't help but muse about a more realized text entry loop. This game has 12 total achievements to earn. Since the game utilizes a level select system, there are no missable achievements. Most achievements are earned by just progressing through the game. The ones that aren't awarded in this manner are obtained by light exploration and finding some collectibles. All in all, very easy to 100% in one sitting. Stories Untold has received several notable awards, including British Academy of Film and Television Arts Game of the Year in 2017. Steam Reviews has it sitting at very positive, while Metacritic has it 7.0 out of 10 user score. It has sold at least over 100,000 copies on Steam. If Steam sales remain roughly the same on the other platforms it was ported to, Nintendo Switch, PlayStation, and Xbox, that would imply at least a few 100,000 people have decided to enter the world the game provides. While adventure games have drastically changed since the days of Colossal Cave Adventure with games like The Walking Dead and Until Dawn, text adventures have mostly fallen out of mainstream gaming discourse. For that reason, the fact that Stories Untold managed to break through in the way it did favors it being a touchstone for many adventure and text adventure games going forward. Ask yourself the following. Do you like arbitrary puzzles? Do you mind some psychological horror in your entertainment? Do you ever wish you could just play through chapters in your favorite book? If you answered yes to all these questions, then this game wasn't made for you. What if you're like me and you can barely stand puzzles in games because they seem to evoke a guess what the developer is thinking type of feeling? I would still recommend the game. The reality of the game is that it can be completed in just a few hours. When you get stuck, look up a guide, solve your roadblock, and get back to enjoying this game's stellar atmosphere. It's really worth experiencing, especially if you live through and or are a fan of the 80s. If you're completely puzzle averse but still enjoy interactive narrative, it might be worth looking up a playthrough or a live stream.